Welcome back to Askewed Reviews. And as I've mentioned before, throughout the year I will randomly be doing Disney films, as Disney recently celebrated its 100th anniversary. So, today we are doing the 1940 film Pinocchio. Here is your trivia question for today. While on Pleasure Island, Lampwick strikes his match on what famous piece of artwork? The answer will be at the end of this episode. So, our film starts off in a village where we meet one of our main characters, a small cricket named Jiminy, who is currently trying to get out of the cold and get near the warmth of a fire. He manages to sneak his way into what appears to be some sort of wood workshop where there are all sorts of toys, music boxes, and clocks littering the entire place. It's here that we meet the woodshop owner, Geppetto, who happens to live by himself for the most part, although he also happens to have a cat named Figaro and a goldfish named Cleo. Geppetto has recently finished making a marionette that he has called Pinocchio. Once Geppetto finally heads to bed, he notices a wishing star in the sky, and he makes his wish, and that wish is that Pinocchio would become a real boy. While Geppetto sleeps, it looks like his wish is about to be granted, as the blue fairy descends and casts a spell on the marionette, bringing it to somewhat life, and telling Pinocchio that he can actually become a real boy if he proves himself. Jiminy Cricket is then assigned as his conscience to teach Pinocchio right from wrong. So, will Pinocchio, a boy who's only been alive for a few hours, be able to prove himself and become a real boy, or will he stay a puppet forever? This movie was directed by Norman Ferguson and T. He. The T stood for Thornton. The story for this film comes from the 1883 novel of the same name that was written by Carlo Collodi. Here's something dark you may not be aware of. Collodi actually wrote the story with the idea that Pinocchio was going to hang himself by the end. It was actually his editor that pushed for a more happy ending. Also, in the original novel, Pinocchio kills Jiminy pretty early on in the story, although in that he's only known as the talking cricket. Pinocchio throws a mallet at him. In the book, the cricket somehow randomly reappears in the story later on, and there's no explanation as to why he's alive again. They did make a little nod towards this in the animated film, as Gideon does try to kill the cricket with a mallet. Also, something you may or may not agree with, even though the film is called Pinocchio, I really do feel like most of the story is more about Jiminy Cricket. Pinocchio was not originally going to be the second Disney movie to come out. It was originally going to be Bambi, but unfortunately, Bambi was taking a little bit longer to actually get completed, while Pinocchio was ready to go. There's also a reference in this film to two other movies that Disney was currently working on that were going to be adapted soon: Peter Pan and Alice in Wonderland. Now, in the early 2000s, there was actually talks of making a sequel called Pinocchio 2. The plot would have dealt with Pinocchio on another strange journey, trying to figure out why life appears to be so unfair sometimes. Apparently, Walt Disney absolutely loved the character of Figaro from this film. So much so that Figaro was actually pushed to be a bigger character in Disney in general. He actually had a few cartoons that were based around him, and for a period of time, Minnie Mouse's pet Fifi was taken out and Figaro became her new pet for a while. The original concept for Jiminy Cricket was to have him look a lot more like the grasshopper from the Silly Symphonies. When the design was shown to Walt Disney, he said it was too gross, and this is why Jiminy resembles more of a small man than a bug. Also, this version of Jiminy is based off of two things. One, the voice actor, Cliff Edwards, who did the voice for Jiminy Cricket, and, strangely enough, the dapper look of the Johnny Walker logo. Animator Ward Kimball has stated that he actually regrets making compromises on that and changing Jiminy to look more like a person than a bug. He even says the only reason that people are willing to accept Jiminy as a cricket is because the characters call him one in the film. Evelyn Venable did the voice and physical modeling for the Blue Fairy. If you didn't know this, she also did the modeling for the original Columbia Studios logo. Walt Disney actually wanted a child to do the voice of Pinocchio, which is why they hired Dickie Jones. Now, here's another interesting thing. The way that they got Dickie to sound the way he did underwater is they specifically designed a microphone with a coiled internal wire and paddles that distorted the sound. The design for the character of Lampwick is actually a caricature of Disney animator Fred Moore. The character of Gideon originally did talk, and he was voiced by famous voiceover actor Mel Blanc, who is much more well known for the Looney Tunes. Now, they eventually decided to make him a mute character, so now the only thing that still exists of Mel Blanc doing it is when Gideon has the hiccups. The characters of Stromboli and the Coachman are both voiced by Charles Judels. If you weren't aware, Monstro is supposed to be based off of a sperm whale. To help the animators get the look right, multiple cuckoo clocks were built for the animators so they could see how they worked and moved. When trying to create what Pleasure Island was like, lots of ideas were thrown around. In fact, some different names were thrown around as well. Two of the ones that I found amusing were Bogeyland and Boobyland. When You Wish Upon a Star went on to become Disney's official theme song. This Disney film has one of, if not the most villains in any Disney film. You have Honest John and Gideon, Stromboli, the Coachman, and Monstro. Although we all know the true villain of the story is the Blue Fairy, as once again, someone from the Fey realm decides to just mess with people and not be able to help them out right from the beginning. Were you aware that when Pinocchio was given the Ace of Spades as a ticket to Pleasure Island, in a lot of myths, the Ace of Spades represents the Death card? Also, something pretty dark, did you happen to notice that the coachman's carriage is pulled by donkeys, and as we all know from the film, little boys that are bad become donkeys? And also, when speaking of things that are dark, that brings us to the section of the video called The Dark Side of Disney. Did you happen to know that the voice actor for Geppetto, Christian Rubb, was actually a Nazi sympathizer? In fact, he would tirelessly talk to the crew and have awkward conversations with them. Another moment that could have been really bad but actually got taken out before they finalized the film is during the song I Got No Strings. There were a bunch of puppets that were primarily from European countries or from Russia. Now, they were planning at one point to have an African puppet, but it would have looked extremely racist as it was trying to do the classic depiction of black people during that time period. Luckily, that was dropped. And here is another segment that I call Disney Theories. These are all ideas that aren't technically proven, but may or may not be correct theories about the film. One theory that I feel is more fact than theory is when inside of Monstro, Geppetto and Figaro seem like they're going to be dying soon, so Cleo begins to move two rocks around, which seem to be gravestones representing her two friends. In the film, you have animals and you also have anthropomorphic animals. Now, the only kind of in between point is when we see that bad boys are turned into donkeys. The theory goes that the coachman is actually the devil, and that he is the one changing people into anthropomorphic animals. This, of course, makes sense with Honest John and Gideon as they are terrible people, but why Jiminy? The theory goes is that Jiminy also at one point was pretty bad, and this is why he knows so much about why you should listen to that little voice called conscience. So when it comes to the film Pinocchio, this is definitely a fun adventure that I do consider a classic. So I'm going to give this one a 5 out of 5. Now, if you can't get enough of Pinocchio, you of course can watch the 2022 live action remake made by Disney, which I haven't watched yet, but I've heard that even Tom Hanks was not able to save it. There's also a live action adaptation that was a made for TV movie for ABC that stars Drew Carey as Geppetto, and it's supposed to be the story of Pinocchio from Geppetto's view. Now, this one I know I have seen, and it is terrible. There was also a video game created in 1996, and speaking of video games, it's not related to Disney's version, but there is a version of Pinocchio that's like Dark Souls called Lies of P. Now, as for the trivia question from the beginning of this episode, while on Pleasure Island, Lampwick strikes his match on what famous piece of artwork? Lampwick lights the match for his cigar off of the painting The Mona Lisa. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Askewed Reviews, and if there's a movie you'd like to see get a review, just mention it in the comments.